Most of the vicious killers who haunt the popular imagination, they're male. Part of the reason behind this is simply that most killers are male. In the US, for example, about 90% of murders are committed by men. However, female killers, they are out there, and women have committed some truly heinous murders. In the video today, we're looking at 10 of the worst examples. Female killers who are at least as evil as their more well-known male counterparts. Number 10. Miyuki Ishikawa. While the full extent of her crimes may never be known, Miyuki Ishikawa, who would go on to be known as Oni-sanba, Demon Midwife, is estimated to have been responsible for the deaths of over 100 newborn babies in her care. In the economic turmoil of post-war Japan, many of the poor couples at Kotobuki Maternity Hospital, where Ishikawa served as director, they could not afford to raise their new babies. Ishikawa's solution to this was a truly heinous one, allowing the babies under her care to starve to death. With the help of her husband and the hospital's physician, Ishikawa arranged to falsify the death records of the babies that she had killed through neglect. Ishikawa's accomplices also solicited payments from the parents of these infants. The horrific murder mill was uncovered when police accidentally found the remains of 5 infant victims and later discovered more than 70 additional bodies. Ishikawa's argument that the true perpetrators were the parents who abandoned their infants apparently had some resonance with the court. She was initially sentenced to only 8 years for her crime, and that term was reduced to 4 years on appeal. Reportedly, this case led the Japanese government to reconsider its ban on abortion. The year after Ishikawa's crimes were brought to light, abortion for economic reasons, it was legalized in Japan. Number 9. Juana Barraza. Police in Mexico City initially suspected that the serial killer who was preying on the city's elderly women with more than 40 victims by some estimates was a man. The killer, who had been dubbed Aviators, the little old lady killer, had been seen leaving a victim's home. Witnesses reported that the killer had been wearing women's clothing but had a heavier frame. The killer posed as a helpful nurse, a neighbor, or a social worker and then entered the homes of the women. Then they would strangle them, often with their clothing or a stethoscope, and leave a small trophy, often a religious statue. Police searched for the killer for a couple of years, even harassing local transvestite groups, but had no luck finding the man that they believed was responsible. The mystery was finally solved when a returning tenant witnessed the killer fleeing the scene after murdering the tenant's 82-year-old landlady. The tenant called the police and they quickly apprehended the person behind the killings, and it wasn't exactly who they were expecting. Instead of the man in drag the police had been searching for, the culprit was a woman, 42-year-old Juana Barraza, who worked part-time as a professional wrestler. Barraza, who denied responsibility for all but one of the murders attributed her crime to lingering resentment towards her abusive mother. She was sentenced to more than 700 years in prison for the murders of 11 women, though she is suspected to have logged dozens more victims before her eventual capture. Number 8. Amelia Dyer. Victorian England was not a place that welcomed unmarried single mothers. Women who gave birth out of wedlock and couldn't financially support their children didn't have many options. One of these options was to turn to a baby farmer, a woman who, exchanged for a fee, would take in and care for the child and or place it up for adoption. Unfortunately, some unscrupulous women determined that they could pocket the money paid by the birth mother without actually following through on the ensuring of a good future for their newborn. The worst of these women was a former nurse called Amelia Dyer. Dyer would place ads in a paper proclaiming that a childless married couple was seeking an infant to raise, along with payments. One ad specifies £10 as the amount sought. Then she would take custody of the baby. Initially, it appears that she killed her young charges by administering opium-laced medications and underfeeding. She even served 6 months imprisonment for neglect after a doctor became suspicious after numerous babies died in her care. Unfortunately, jail did not stop Dyer. Upon her release, she returned to her murderous ways, though she had learned how to conceal her crimes by now. She also moved frequently, used several different names, and disposed of babies' bodies on her own. She was eventually caught when the bodies of 2 babies, which she had packaged and thrown in the Thames, floated to the surface. It was identifying information on the packaging that finally did her in. After first attempting suicide in police custody, Dyer eventually confessed, adding a chilling detail for the police investigators. "You'll know which ones are mine by the tape around their necks." She reportedly had used tape to strangle the babies. A jury took only 5 minutes to convict Dyer, and she was sentenced to death for the murders. On June 20th, 1896, she was executed by hanging for murder. Overall, it's estimated that she was responsible for the murder of hundreds of infants. Number 7. Leonarda Cianciulli. Leonarda Cianciulli struck most folks in her small Italian town of Correggio as a kindly middle-aged woman who ran a small shop in town and doted on her 4 children. When you hear murderous cannibal, Cianciulli is not the person who you picture, but nevertheless, that is exactly what she became. Cianciulli lost several pregnancies as well as several children early in their childhoods and was extra protective of her remaining brood. Reportedly, when a fortune teller told Cianciulli that she would need to kill to protect her remaining children, Cianciulli took it to heart. When, in 1939, it appeared Cianciulli's beloved eldest son would be joining the army in the lead up to World War II, Cianciulli went to work. From 1939 to 1940, Cianciulli lured 3 middle-aged women into her shop, offering them advice, saying that she had found the first one a husband and the latter 2 jobs. She encouraged the women to tell everyone they knew that they would soon be leaving to more distant cities to begin their new lives. Then, one by one, she invited them over for a meal before their planned departures, knocking them out with drugged wine and then killing and dismembering them with an axe. Disposing of the bodies might have presented a problem for another woman, but Cianciulli had soap-making equipment at hand and used the caustic soda to melt them down in her soap-making pot, using the blood as an ingredient for cookies. Cianciulli details the process in her confession, saying, "I made lots of crunchy tea cakes and served them to the ladies who came to visit, but Giuseppe and I also ate them." Giuseppe was her son. Cianciulli became better with practice, saying that she was able to produce some most acceptable creamy soap from the remains of her 3rd victim, and that the cakes too were better. That woman was really sweet. Cianciulli's crimes were discovered after the sister-in-law of the 3rd victim spotted her entering Cianciulli's house but not exiting. This is information that she shared with the police after her sister-in-law went missing. After her killing spree came to light, Cianciulli became known as the soap maker of Correggio. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison and died in 1970 in a criminal asylum. Number 6. Dagmar Overbye. Like Amelia Dyer, Dagmar Overbye was a baby farmer with a dark side. Her killing spree in 1920s Copenhagen, Denmark followed a similar trajectory to Dyer's, though it may have begun with the murder of her own child, who died under mysterious circumstances. Overbye claimed to be an adoption facilitator, taking unwanted children from poor women who paid Overbye a year's wages to find their child a loving home. However, instead of arranging for adoptions, Overbye murdered the children, usually by strangling them and then disposing of their bodies by burying them and hiding them in the attic, or even baking them in her oven. The latter of these is what resulted in her nickname, the Vesterbro baby burner. Overbye went on undetected for 7 years and claimed an estimated 25 infant victims, but it could have gone on much longer. However, one birth mother, Caroline Egerson, had a change of heart the day after she left her newborn daughter with Overbye. When Overbye claimed not to remember the address of the adoptive couple with whom the child supposedly had been left, Egerson became suspicious and reported Overbye to the police. Upon visiting Overbye's home, the police discovered the baby's discarded clothing, as well as the remains of an infant's skull and bones in the stove. Overbye was arrested for murdering 16 children, though only convicted of 9 deaths because evidence was lacking in some of the cases. She was sentenced to death for her crimes, though the Danish king later commuted her sentence to life in prison. Overbye died in prison in 1929. Number 5. Belle Gunness. Belle Gunness may have looked like a big-boned, plain Midwestern farm wife, but her charms were evidently sufficient to lure dozens of men to their deaths at her hands. It isn't clear Belle Gunness started out life as a killer. She likely began with arson and insurance fraud, as she and her first husband collected on insurance proceeds when their struggling candy shop, then their home, burned down. But Belle appears to have moved on to murder fairly quickly, with 2 of the couple's 4 children dying as infants on which Belle and her husband held life insurance policies, on which they later collected. Her first husband wasn't long for the world either, dying on the only day of the year in which his 2 life insurance policies were in effect. A local doctor decided it was heart failure, but it could have easily been poisoning. Belle took her newfound wealth and bought a pig farm in Indiana, marrying a local widower. The widower's infant daughter died mysteriously shortly after the wedding, and then Belle's new husband died in a tragic accident with a meat grinder. If you're guessing that Belle had a life insurance policy on him as well, you're correct. From there on out, she catfished and then murdered a series of men by placing ads in Norwegian-language newspapers implying that she was seeking a man with who she would share her life and her farm. When the love-struck men showed up with their life savings, Belle poisoned them, chopping up their bodies and then either burying them or feeding them to her hogs. When one of these suitors' brothers started digging into his disappearance, Belle's home burned to the ground. 4 bodies were found in the charred remnants of the home, 3 children corresponding in size to Belle's children, and a headless woman. The woman's frame appeared smaller than Belle's, but some of Belle's false teeth were found near the body. Investigators combing through the farm looking for the body head didn't find it, but they did find other human bones, teeth, and a bunch of men's watches. They conclusively unearthed 14 bodies and estimated that the total body count may have been as high as 40. As for Belle, she may have gotten away with it. Her bank accounts had been almost completely emptied shortly before the fire, and a handyman, who had been Belle's on-again, off-again lover and accomplice in disposing of her suitors' bodies, claimed that Belle had killed a maid she recently hired and left the body in the house before burning it to the ground. More than 40 years later, a woman named Esther Carlson, who looked an awful lot like Belle Gunness, was arrested in Los Angeles for poisoning a Norwegian-American man for his money. She died while awaiting trial, and the truth about whatever happened to Belle Gunness, it may have died along with her. Number 4. Jane Toppan. The cheerful demeanor Jane Toppan displayed during her nursing work earned her the nickname Jolly Jane. But Jane wasn't jolly to cheer up her patients who were dying. Jane was jolly because her patients were suffering and dying, sometimes at her hands. After her arrest, Toppan admitted to 31 murders, saying that she derived sexual pleasure from the life or death power that she held over her patients. Toppan's landlord and later his wife were among Toppan's earliest victims. She also killed off friends and subsequent landlords. When her landlord's wife came to collect on past due rent, Toppan poisoned her, then killed the landlord as well and the landlord's 2 daughters. With this, though, she had finally gone too far. The father-in-law of one of the landlord's daughters was suspicious that 4 members of a seemingly healthy family could die so suddenly. He had the family's bodies exhumed and evaluated by a toxicologist. Testing revealed that the man's daughter-in-law had died of atropine and morphine poisoning. Shortly thereafter, on October 29, 1901, Toppan was arrested for murder. She confessed to 31 murders, though she is suspected of killing up to 100 people in total. However, she was found not guilty by reason of insanity and eventually died at the hospital where she was confined. Number 3. Gertrude Baniszewski. Unlike the other killers in this video, Baniszewski is only responsible for the death of one person, that of 16-year-old Sylvia Likens. However, the sustained torture that Baniszewski subjected Likens to in the weeks before her death, as well as the fact that she involved both her own children and neighborhood children in Likens' abuse, made this killing especially heinous. The Indianapolis Police Department's homicide chief would later call the abuse and murder of Likens the most sadistic act I ever came across. Sylvia Likens' living nightmare began when her parents, traveling carnival workers, dropped her and her 15-year-old sister Jenny off with Baniszewski. Baniszewski, who had 7 children of her own at home, had agreed to care for the sisters for $20 a week while their parents were working elsewhere. When the Likens' parents were late paying their boarding fees, Baniszewski turned her wrath on Sylvia, who she later accused of spreading rumors about her daughters. Not only did Baniszewski torture Sylvia, beating her, subjecting her to burning water, starving her, burning her with cigarettes, and pushing her down the stairs, she also encouraged her kids and kids from the neighborhood to do the same. Baniszewski encouraged a 15-year-old neighbor to etch "I am a prostitute and proud of it" into Sylvia's stomach with a sewing needle that she provided. In a rather dark detail, she helped him with the spelling of the word prostitute. By the time the police were called to the house on October 26, 1965, it was too late for her. Sylvia's mangled body was found on a filthy mattress, and her sister begged police to get her out of the home and told them the whole story. Gertrude Baniszewski was tried, along with several of her children, for the torture and murder of Sylvia Likens. Baniszewski was sentenced to life in prison, but she was released for good behavior after serving less than 20 years of her sentence. Number 2. Delphine LaLaurie. Delphine LaLaurie, a wealthy Louisiana socialite, was well known in antebellum New Orleans, both for her beauty and the lavish events that she and her husband hosted. However, in the early 1830s, she was in the public eye for a rather different reason: the cruelty that she displayed towards her slaves. The first incident came in 1833, when LaLaurie, enraged that a 12-year-old slave girl who had been brushing her hair had hit a tangle, and then she chased the girl with a whip. The terrified girl ran off the roof to her death. LaLaurie tossed her body in the well. Investigators made her pay a fine and sell her slaves, but she quickly bought them back. On April 10, 1834, LaLaurie's French Quarter mansion caught fire, possibly as a suicide attempt by a slave who was found chained to the oven. A gathering crowd noticed Delphine running to save their possessions from the fire and wondered where her slaves were. This was a question that Delphine would not answer. Bystanders quickly realized that the slaves were trapped in the attic of the home, which was locked. According to the local paper, several gentlemen, impelled by their feelings of humanity, demanded the keys, which were refused to them in a gross and insulting manner. When the men finally got in, the most appalling spectacle met their eyes. 7 slaves, more or less horribly mutilated, were seen suspended by the neck, with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other. Even in the context of a time when slavery was commonplace, LaLaurie's cruelty apparently stood out. When word got out about the abuse the slaves had suffered, a mob quickly formed and destroyed the home's contents. The LaLauries quickly fled, apparently leaving New Orleans and perhaps the country. Little is known about their subsequent lives. Reports suggest that at least 2 of the slaves died of their injuries after their rescue, and that other bodies were also found on the grounds of the property. Number 1. Darya Nikolayevna Saltykova. Darya Nikolayevna Saltykova, commonly known as Saltychichka, was another noblewoman with a dark side. A young Russian widow, Saltykova had inherited her husband's sizable holdings in 1756, which included a number of serfs. Saltykova was reportedly a very unhappy woman with a violent temper, which she was prone to taking out on her female serfs. Reportedly, Saltykova beat them, mutilated them, poured boiling water on them, and threw them outside without clothes in the freezing winter. More than 100 serfs are estimated to have died at her hands. Because Saltykova had powerful political connections, it took a long time for her to be brought to justice, despite the mounting body count. Finally, in 1762, Empress Catherine II ordered Saltykova's arrest. A 6-year investigation followed, noting as many as 138 suspicious deaths connected with the woman. Saltykova was eventually found guilty of torturing 38 female serfs to death. She was sentenced to be chained to a platform in the center of Moscow for an hour, wearing a sign around her neck saying, "I have tortured and murdered," after which she spent the remainder of her life in prison, spitting and waving a stick at people who passed by her cell. So I'm not going to ask if you enjoyed that video, but I do hope you found it interesting at least. If you did, please do give us a thumbs up below, and do not forget to subscribe. We've got brand new videos just like this, or a little less dark than this most of the time, every day of the week. If you're looking for something else to watch, why not check out my other channel called Biographics. We've got some biographies of pretty notable serial killers on there, so please do check that out, link below. And as always, thank you for watching.